By the early months of 1942, the Japanese Empire had unleashed a wave of conquest across the Pacific, a seemingly unstoppable force that swept aside the colonial powers with terrifying speed and brutality. The humiliation at Pearl Harbor was just the beginning, as Japanese forces stormed through Southeast Asia, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, and the supposedly impregnable British fortress of Singapore in a stunning defeat that shook the Western world to its core. The rising sun now flew over millions of square miles of new territory, and its leaders dreamed of an even greater empire, a vast co-prosperity sphere that would make them the dominant power in the entire Pacific region. The momentum was entirely theirs, and the next logical step on the map, lying just beyond the island chain of the Dutch East Indies, was the vast, resource-rich, and seemingly vulnerable continent of Australia. For the Australian people, the threat felt not just real, but imminent and existential, a terrifying shadow looming over their sunburnt land. The fall of Singapore was a catastrophic betrayal, a wound that shattered the illusion of protection by the mighty British motherland, leaving the nation exposed and utterly alone against a merciless enemy. Refugees and battle-weary soldiers began to arrive with horrifying tales of Japanese atrocities, painting a grim picture of what an occupation might look like, with stories of brutal treatment of civilians and prisoners of war that spread like wildfire. In cities like Sydney and Brisbane, residents dug slit trenches in their backyards, prepared for air raids, and watched the horizon with a gnawing dread, knowing that the Japanese war machine had never been stopped. They listened to the radio for news, their hearts pounding with every report of another island falling, another city bombed, as the enemy moved inexorably closer. To understand the terrifying reason the Japanese ultimately turned back, we must first understand that they absolutely intended to invade, a fact confirmed by the meticulous planning they undertook in secret. The Japanese Imperial Army didn't just think about it. They compiled detailed intelligence dossiers, creating invasion plans and assembling crucial information about their potential target. One chilling artifact of this intent is a rare album compiled by the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Army in Jakarta, filled with maps, aerial photographs, and postcards of major Australian cities and infrastructure. These documents, now preserved in libraries, were not mere souvenirs. They were tools of war, intended to guide pilots to their bombing targets and soldiers to their landing zones, highlighting strategic locations like dams, mines, smelters, and factories. This captured intelligence album reveals the specific locations the Japanese war machine considered most valuable, the industrial heartland they hoped to cripple or capture in a future invasion. One of the most highly targeted areas was the region around Mornington in Victoria, along with its surrounding industrial environs, which was seen as crucial to Australia's war-making capability. There are also numerous aerial views of northern port cities like Darwin and Broome, places that would indeed soon feel the weight of Japanese bombs, serving as a terrifying preview of what was to come. However, the album also contained telling errors, like a photograph mistakenly labelled as the Perth railway station, which was, in fact, a picture of the Adelaide railway station, a small but significant detail that hints at the limitations of their long-range intelligence. The drive to isolate and potentially invade Australia was championed most aggressively by the Imperial Japanese Navy, which saw the continent as a critical strategic threat to their dominance. After their stunning successes in the first 6 months of the war, the Navy High Command, intoxicated by victory, began formulating plans for a further expansion that would eliminate Australia as a potential base for an American counteroffensive. They envisioned a campaign that would seize Port Moresby in New Guinea, then move to cut the supply lines between the United States and Australia, thereby neutralizing the continent and preventing it from becoming, as they feared, a springboard for revenge. For them, controlling the Pacific meant controlling or isolating its major landmasses, and Australia stood directly in the path of their ambition. But these ambitious naval plans for an invasion were met with fierce and immediate resistance from a more pragmatic, though no less brutal, institution, the Imperial Japanese Army. When the Navy presented its proposal for a full-scale invasion of Australia, requiring at least 12 Army divisions and a staggering amount of shipping tonnage, the Army reacted with what one of its senior officers, Colonel Takushiro Hattori, called sheer disbelief, labeling the plan as outrageous. The Army was already stretched thin, with its main forces bogged down in a seemingly endless war in China, unable to provide the hundreds of thousands of troops needed for such a massive amphibious operation. They knew that conquering a continent the size of Australia, with its harsh terrain and widely dispersed population centers, was a logistical fantasy that would bleed Japan dry. The debate between the two military branches became so intense that it required the intervention of the highest authority in Japan, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo himself. The Navy argued passionately that seizing Australia was essential to secure Japan's southern flank and access its resources, while the Army, backed by the government's planning board, pointed to the impossible strain on manpower and shipping. Tojo, an Army general himself, ultimately sided with his own service, formally rejecting the invasion plan. In its place, a compromise was reached. Instead of conquering Australia, Japan would isolate it, cutting the vital sea lanes between the United States and its ally by seizing islands like New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. The key to this new strategy of isolation was Port Moresby, a strategically vital Allied base located on the southern coast of Australian-controlled Papua New Guinea, directly north of Australia. From Port Moresby, Japanese long-range bombers could dominate the Coral Sea and strike deep into the Australian mainland, making any Allied attempt to launch a counteroffensive from down under impossibly dangerous. Control of Port Moresby was the linchpin, the final piece needed to complete the isolation of Australia and slam the door shut on the Americans. Capturing it became the immediate, overriding objective for the Japanese, a goal that would put their strategy to the test and decide the fate of the Pacific War. The operation to take Port Moresby was codenamed MO, and it was to be a complex, seaborne invasion, a thrust that would finally bring the Japanese war machine to Australia's doorstep. A powerful invasion force, consisting of thousands of elite soldiers on transports, was assembled and escorted by a formidable fleet that included the light carrier Shoho and a covering group of heavy cruisers. To provide air cover and destroy any Allied naval interference, two of Japan's newest and most powerful fleet carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were dispatched into the Coral Sea. It was a plan that seemed destined for success, a final, decisive blow that would seal Australia's fate. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, their coded messages detailing the entire MO operation had been intercepted and painstakingly deciphered by American codebreakers, who had made significant progress in cracking the Japanese naval code, JN-25. This intelligence was a priceless gift, a window into the enemy's intentions that allowed the outnumbered and outgunned Allies to prepare a trap of their own. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the cool-headed commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made a calculated and risky decision. He dispatched his only available carriers in the Pacific, the USS Yorktown and the USS Lexington, on a high-speed dash into the Coral Sea, with one simple, desperate objective: to stop the Japanese invasion fleet at all costs. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the course of history. In early May 1942, the American carrier task forces, under tactical command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, slipped into the vast Coral Sea, northeast of Australia, lying in wait for the enemy they knew was coming. The Japanese, confident in their invincibility and unaware their codes were broken, proceeded with their plan, sending the light carrier Shoho to cover initial landings on the small island of Tulagi. This was the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never sighted each other, fighting through the deadly swarms of their carrier aircraft, a new kind of warfare that would decide the fate of the Pacific. On May 7th, the battle began with frantic searches and critical errors that could have been disastrous for either side. American scout planes located a Japanese carrier force, and due to a miscommunication, every available bomber was launched against what they thought were the big enemy fleet carriers. When they arrived at the coordinates, they found not the giants, but the much smaller Shoho, which was caught completely by surprise. The attack was swift and merciless. Waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes pummeled the light carrier, turning it into a blazing inferno in just minutes. As the Shoho slipped beneath the waves, a young American pilot radioed back a message that became legendary: "Scratch one flat top." It was the first Japanese aircraft carrier ever sunk by American forces, a monumental blow signaling that the Japanese were not invincible. But the battle was far from over. Simultaneously, the Japanese launched a massive strike against what they thought were the American carriers, only to discover they had sunk a mere destroyer and an oiler, a humiliating waste of their formidable air power. The climax arrived on the morning of May 8th, when both fleets finally found their primary targets. The opposing carrier forces, separated by only 175 miles, launched every available aircraft in a final, all-out, simultaneous strike. American dive bombers found the Shokaku and pummeled it with multiple bomb hits, ripping open its flight deck and leaving it heavily damaged and on fire. But at almost the exact same moment, the Japanese strike arrived over the American ships, and their aim was just as true. The USS Lexington, a massive converted battlecruiser known as Lady Lex, became the focus of the Japanese attack. She was struck by 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs, causing massive damage and raging fires. For a time, It seemed she might survive, but then a massive internal explosion, caused by leaking aviation gasoline vapors igniting deep within the hull, ripped the ship apart. The fires raged out of control, and Lady Lex was doomed, forcing her crew to abandon ship. The Yorktown also took a bomb hit, but her damage was less severe. When the smoke cleared, both fleets faced a stark reality. Tactically, the Japanese had won a victory, having sunk a 43,000-ton American fleet carrier, while losing only the 11,000-ton light carrier Shoho. But strategically, it was a profound defeat for Japan. The Shokaku was heavily damaged and would be out for months. More importantly, the veteran air groups of both fleet carriers had been decimated, losing dozens of irreplaceable pilots. With their carrier air power crippled and their invasion force left without air cover, the Japanese commanders had no choice but to order the retreat. Port Moresby was saved. However, the immediate threat was far from over. The Japanese army, frustrated by the Navy's failure, launched an overland offensive across the treacherous Owen-Stanley Mountains, along the infamous Kokoda Track, aiming to capture Port Moresby from the rear. A bitter, bloody campaign began in the jungles of New Guinea, pitting Australian soldiers against a fanatical enemy in some of the most brutal conditions on Earth. If they succeeded, Australia would still be within reach. As the Japanese pushed along the Kokoda Track, another desperate confrontation exploded at Milne Bay. In August 1942, they landed elite forces to seize Allied airstrips there. What they didn't know was that the Allies had garrisoned the bay with a significant force of Australian troops supported by RAAF Kitty Hawk fighters. The ensuing battle, fought in pouring rain and clinging mud, became a defining moment in Australian military history. The Australians held their ground, and by early September, the Japanese were forced into a fighting retreat. It was Japan's first unequivocal defeat on land. But what of the Grand Japanese plan to invade Australia itself? The answer lies in another, even more decisive battle, Midway. The damaged USS Yorktown, patched up in just 3 days at Pearl Harbor, sailed to meet the Japanese fleet, where her aircraft helped sink 4 of Japan's finest fleet carriers. The Japanese carriers essential for any future invasion of Australia were now at the bottom of the ocean, along with their irreplaceable pilots. Japan's offensive power was permanently broken. Yet, even without invasion, the war came to Australia in other terrifying ways. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the northern coast was subjected to 97 separate Japanese air raids, a constant rain of fire. The most devastating was the bombing of Darwin on February 19, 1942, a surprise attack more destructive than Pearl Harbor in terms of bombs dropped. Japanese submarines also struck at Sydney Harbor, sinking the ferry HMAS Kudable and killing 21 sailors, bringing the war right into Australia's backyard. The terrifying reason Japan ultimately turned back was not a single event, but a combination of strategic realities, immense logistical hurdles, and military failure. The sheer scale of the operation required over 250,000 troops and 1 million tons of shipping, a fantasy for an already overstretched nation. And when the Navy's attempt to cut supply lines and seize Port Moresby was thwarted at Coral Sea, the window of opportunity slammed firmly shut. Furthermore, the defenders proved far more resilient than Japan ever anticipated. From naval gunners at Coral Sea to infantrymen on the Kokoda Track, the Allies demonstrated a ferocious will to fight that cost Japan its momentum and its irreplaceable veteran forces. The Japanese learned a terrible truth in 1942. The further they pushed, the stronger their enemy became, while their own strength could only dwindle. In the end, the story of why Japan never invaded Australia is a story of a terrifying plan that came within a hair's breadth of being realized, only to be undone by codebreakers, carrier pilots, jungle soldiers, and the sheer logistics of a continent. The Japanese turned back not out of mercy, but because they were forced to, their momentum broken in the fiery crucible of the Coral Sea and the muddy tracks of New Guinea. Australia was saved not by a plan, but by the sacrifices of those who fought and died to keep the enemy at bay.